Hello, everyone. We are here with another interview, and this time we are with David Griscom, co-host of the Left Reckoning podcast, which I highly recommend. It's a pretty chilled and cool coverage of American news, as well as a contributor to Jacobin magazine, as well as other publications. So I'm very happy to have you here. Before we jump into like questions and all that, would you like to tell us about your podcast or whatever your
Mhm.
other things you do?
Yeah, sure. Left Reckoning, Matt and I were both the producers on the Michael Brooks show, and in 2021, we launched Left Reckoning, and it's a left-wing politics and history podcast. We cover like U.S. politics, but also a lot of international issues. And I think one of the things that Matt and I try to do is not solely being focused on like Texas and the Midwest, but trying to bring perspectives from people from that part of the country to like national politics and international lefty news. So
Yeah, and it's pretty cool. Yeah, and you also do readings of texts and stuff, very accessible, very fun. 18
mhm.
18th Burmese. What is that,
The
Marx?
18th
I always
Brumaire, yeah.
Brumaire. Burmese, I think Burmese is better, but yeah, Brumaire is good too. But that's a fun read. But I really enjoy your show and all that. So what did you have anything specific in mind when you started out? Any specific goal?
Oh, with the left, I mean, the thing is, like in the US, most of the left and socialist podcasts are all in New York City and LA and Chicago, right? Nothing wrong with that. That's where a lot of people live. But, there's a lot of socialists and Marxists in, the flyover states or in the South and the Midwest. And, I think it's important sometimes to be able to represent those movements and like ideas, and also say that like you don't have to leave home, for example, to be a socialist, right? And a lot of people in the South in particular feel like, oh, if I have this kind of politics I have to get out, right? Which, like, again, don't judge people for doing that, but you have to be able to fight for progressive politics and socialist policies everywhere, right, if you want to live in a better world.
Sure, yeah, but definitely agree with that. Talking about Texas, actually, that brings me to my first and probably most important question. Do you know Chuck Norris? And do you know how to do a roundhouse kick? Or was that part of I believe that's part of the curriculum in Texas. Is it?
Yeah, well, I did do karate when I was a kid, but no, I mean, Texas is funny because I always wonder what the outside perspective of Texas is.
Chuck
Um,
Norris.
it's Chuck Norris, which I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
pretty, at least badass, right?
Very badass. Yes. Yeah. No, but yeah, I put it in one of the questions I sent you that what do you think? What makes Texas different from the rest of the South, do you think? And what are some of the like stereotypes that may not be very accurate?
Yeah, I mean, like like a big fight that people always get into is like Texas a part of the South even, right?
Oh,
And like I could go on about that for a really long time. It might be uninteresting to folks, but like, I mean, Texas is certainly a southern state, but it's also a state that, it's the beginning of the West. It's also where the end of the United States is, and meets Mexico. And like, I think the best way to think about Texas's history in terms of like population and people is to understand that, like, in this like early history, obviously this land has been occupied and lived in for thousands of years by native and indigenous people, but like there was like a few large groups that came in the 1800s, right? A lot of it was Southerners leaving the South, both before the Civil War at the founding of the Republic of Texas, and then after the Civil War a lot of people moved to Texas. So it has that kind of continuity and Southern culture. But also, there are Tejanos, people who've lived in Texas when it was, still Spanish
oh,
territory. Then were there under Mexico when it was, Mexican province, and then stayed after the revolution, right? So that changes it from that makes Texas very distinct, for example, from like a Louisiana or Alabama. And then in the late 1800s, you have this massive migration of Germans. and Czechs, a lot of them radical socialists. In fact, Karl Marx actually tried to move to San Antonio and was denied exit from Prussia at the time. Right. So Texas is an interesting state because it has a lot of like very Southern characteristics, right? Food and culture. But it's unique. And like, is it a part of the South? I mean, I think the kind of quick answer to that is like, it's very Southern, but it's also its own thing. It has a very strong identity that I think is different from a lot of like Southern states where like, people in Alabama or Tennessee, like they very much identify as being from Tennessee or being from Alabama. But there is that kind of like, oh, we're in the South, where, Texans, I don't think get very worked up about that idea because, I mean, Texas is such a massive territory. It has such a unique history and culture. That I think there are just fundamental differences, and the Western South in general, like Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, also have a very distinct history, I think, from some of the more like Eastern Southern states like South Carolina and Georgia. But that's like history. Like today, Texas is one of the largest, if it was its own country, be one of the largest economies in the world. Despite our image of being, a very rural state, Texas is predominantly urban. Something like 90% of Texans live in urban areas. The population is very concentrated in what's called the Texas Triangle, which goes from Dallas to the Austin, San Antonio area to Houston. And that's where the vast majority of the state population lives. So like, Texas is like a very, I mean, like I'm from here. I love it for a lot of reasons, but it's a very interesting place to cover politically, because you do have like these like myths and these histories and these ideas that sort of run up against like the actual reality for people. Texas being a very urban state, and Texas is also, in the past, in my lifetime, like the kind of traditional immigrant story to America was like you go to Ellis Island and you go to New York, right? But now, if you are somebody who's coming, predominantly a lot of like immigration we're getting from Asia, and obviously people coming from the Americas, like they're coming here, right? We have massive populations of Vietnamese and Indian people, so Texas is a state that is changing, pretty dramatically, and I think in a lot of ways, for the better. And it's just an absolutely fascinating thing. And like, maybe last thing I'll just say on the culture before I'd love to hear if you have any thing you'd like to dig into. But one thing that I think is really interesting about Texas, even compared to other places, is that the Texas like culture is very accessible. And what I mean by that is like you can move here and become a Texan. And it's one of those things that's always really fascinating, like predominantly like in Houston, you really see that, where there'll be guys, whose family, they might be first generation American, like their family might be from Vietnam, and they talk like I do, right? But they also have like their own unique, culture, which I think for the longevity of, when everything's changed, people get really worried, oh, this is gonna be lost or that's gonna be lost. But I think there's, a lot of potential for like a kind of cultural continuity that also embraces, all of these new groups. And, I mean, we'll get into it later. The politics here are awful, right? But I do have a lot of love for the people here.
Yeah, fair enough. Talking of immigration to Texas, so what do you think of? I'm sure you're loving the internal immigration, which like Joe Rogan's, Elon Musk. What do you think of that type of immigration to Texas? Are they? I mean, a lot of jobs, I suppose, are being brought. Is that fair to say, or is that too much? Is that
Well, I mean,
exaggeration?
so Texas is like a lot of other southern states now. We're seeing a lot of internal migration. And you're seeing it across all industries. One that's just really notable is like automobile manufacturing. And why are they moving to the South, right? Well, it's not because they like the weather. It's because there's low rates of unionization and the labor laws
Cheap.
here are a lot weaker. So they can pay people less. They don't have to deal with the union. So you're seeing a lot of migration of jobs and industry to Texas. But yeah, the jobs have become more precarious, more dangerous compared to like what they might be in like a Michigan, for example. The Musks and the Rogans are interesting too. I'm from Austin, and that's where they're coming. Austin was a pretty small town up, for most of my life, and has exploded dramatically in the past 15 years in population. And you're feeling that like in the sense of infrastructure. We don't have like rail or public transportation, and there's a housing crisis because, the building hasn't sort of caught up with the influx of folks. But like, Joe Rogan's like one thing, right? Because he's just a guy, who does a podcast. Elon Musk is moving his companies here. Why is he doing that? It's because, he was facing a lot of investigation in California for the labor practices, particularly in the Fremont facility in California. And he moved here to start to build out, the Cybertruck and a few other Tesla products that they're building here. And he did it so that he could tap into like a cheaper and less organized labor force. And it's been pretty brutal. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people have died recently building these Tesla facilities. So, it's interesting because you're seeing this influx of capital, but in Austin in particular, it's predominantly tech, and tech is rough for like the local economy because, unlike some things that are maybe more industrial, where you're hiring more like blue collar accessible jobs, tech predominantly hires people with high levels of education, and predominantly are bringing in people from out of state to fill those jobs. So like, are these jobs being filled by Texans or those kind of families, or are wealthier people from the rest of the rest of the United States moving here? That is like a big part of the affordability crisis. And I've seen it in my life, just sort of anecdotally. Austin was always like a very kind of, there's always rich people here, don't get me wrong, but it was a very affordable city, and you're starting to see prices for houses and food and things like that reaching like New York City or Los Angeles levels of cost. And it means a lot of people whose families might have been in Austin for 50, 60, 70 years are moving out of the city into like the smaller and more suburban towns around, because they can no longer live in Austin because it's become so unaffordable because of all this influx. But it's sort of interesting in the past few months. I don't want to sit here and say that it's going to return to what it was before, but there is a kind of crisis in the tech industry and in real estate speculation in general. So a lot of those companies are, Facebook, for example, was going to fill up a massive skyscraper here. They backed out of that deal. There's the property values are declining pretty rapidly here because a lot of people were buying houses, which are very nice to me, but they're very modest, kind of working class houses, and they were spending $1 million on them, and realizing that like that's a hard sell for people, to continue that kind of growth. So I don't think it will return to maybe what it was like in the 90s or the early 2000s, but I do think the kind of enthusiasm and like the high rates of speculation are starting to hit up to that wall of like reality in Austin, at least.
That's is it the same in Houston and Dallas, the other two?
Yeah, the one big difference between them is like, Houston is a massive US city. It's one of the largest in the country. And Dallas, as well. So yes, all of these cities are seeing massive rates of growth. Like Texas is just going through a massive population boom. So it's certainly similar there. I think Austin's just a little bit unique because it just like geographically and historically was just never supposed to be a major population center, and now is becoming one of those. So I think that there's some unique aspects to it. But no, Houston's going through similar kinds of massive waves of population increase, as is Dallas, as is San Antonio. As I was saying, the Texas triangle is I think it's like if not the like one of the fastest growing population centers in the entirety of the United States. So like Texas is growing and expanding really rapidly, and politically that means one thing, but economically it's meaning significant changes for the state.
That's hopefully for the better. Before focusing more on politics, just talking of Texas and Texas culture, I always had a view that it kind of reminded me of south of Iran, where you have large swaths of just desert or mountain, and then just one city, and then again. Is that, and then people are tend to be very relaxed, very chilled, and somewhat opposed to working hard. Is that the same in Texas, or like?
Well, I mean, I do, it is funny to me. I think people do think of Texas as like a big desert. And like Texas is massive, right? So there are parts of it. West Texas in particular is very much a desert. Where I live, is called the Hill Country. So we have massive rolling hills, a lot of limestone, and a lot of really incredible like natural springs that have been underwater for miles and miles and miles, and then they pop up here. So you get really cold natural underground spring water, which is like 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very nice when it's 100 degrees like it is here right now, to be able to jump in and swim. No, but I mean, Texas has like a very a very large and diverse like geography, right? So like East Texas is sort of like the end of the southern pine forests. South Texas, is coastal, obviously. Where I'm at in the Hill Country is very hilly with a lot of big trees and live oaks, and a pretty large savanna. And then West Texas is where you get that more kind of classic Western movie, tumbleweed town kind of thing. Not too many mountains, actually. More, if anything, the ranges are more on the border with New Mexico, in the west. I mean, culturally, like, it really like depends on where you're at. So like, I would say that like East Texas culturally is like more what you might sort of expect from the South, right? That part of Texas is much more southern. Central Texas, I think, is really unique because it had such a large German and Czech population that came here. And then obviously like a very significant, I mean, San Antonio is one of the oldest cities in North America. It was one of the early Spanish settlements here. So that's a really old, and a very diverse city. And then West Texas is very, very sparsely populated. But like culturally, I mean, it's hard to drill down. I mean, there's so many unique cultures here. I think that like if you wanted to do a kind of bumper sticker version of like Texas culture in terms of how people are very warm and inviting. There's a kind of understanding of like of looking out for one another, like maybe not as much politically, unfortunately, but in the sense like if you're having hard times, your neighbor will help you out. And there's always been a kind of libertarian streak here too, where it's like you live your life, I live mine, which I think sometimes people sort of have mistaken for it being like very, very progressive necessarily. It's much more just like, you don't bother me, I don't bother you kind of mentality. But
That's
there's
progressive.
yeah, I guess
Kind
so.
of
No, it's,
progressive.
I think so too. I mean, there is that kind of like, if you mess with me, there'll be hell to
I'll
pay
mess
as
with you.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I mean, you mentioned that you enjoy country music a lot in a lot of interviews. I just wondered, for a novice who
Mm-hmm.
I'm musically really just pretty much challenged, I was wondering, like, where should one start? I do like Johnny Cash because since you're a kid, you hear that, so
Yeah. I
that's
mean,
pretty.
Johnny Cash is a great place to start. I mean, if you're looking for a place to get into it, Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, Waylon
Oh,
Jennings.
yeah.
Yeah, and Willie and Waylon are both Texans, as is Chris Christopherson. And they created this super group with Johnny Cash called the Highwaymen, where they all got together and created this big band and started singing together. Really fun, stuff that I think is like very accessible. I mean, like Texas produces a lot of musicians, like obviously not just country, rap, hip hop, blues, and jazz, but just staying on the country. I mean, Billy Joe Shaver is a personal favorite of mine. A real wild kind of character, who famously like forced his way into becoming a country music singer by threatening Waylon Jennings, who was like the big star at the time, showed up
Threatening?
at his place. Yeah, so Willie Nelson, who's like a legend here, has this very famous July 4th picnic that he's been doing forever, right? And Billy Joe Shaver is just like a, pretty normal guy, sort of struggling artist, and he played a set there, and there's this guy in the front row who's just, it was like almost empty, the the stage that Billy Joe Shaver's playing, but there's just one guy in front of him who's losing his mind, like this is the best thing, who's definitely drunk and on some kind of drugs or something, was very excited to listen to his music. And Waylon, who again was like the biggest star at that time, says, you should come and meet me in Nashville, Tennessee, and like let's record some songs together. Then Billy, of course, is like, this is amazing, my life's about to change. Never hears anything. So he drives out to Nashville, finds out where Waylon Jennings is, shows up at his recording studio, and somebody meets him at the door. It's like, oh, Waylon's not seeing anybody. And Billy refuses to leave. Somebody comes out with $100 bill, like folded up real crisp, hands it to Billy Joe Shaver, and says, Waylon can't see you. Sorry for your trouble. Gives him the money. Billy looks back at me, says, you can tell him to take this and shove it up his rear end and twist it. So they then bring him in, and Waylon Jennings says, here's how this is going to work. I'll let you sing one song. If I like it, you can sing another song. If I like that, you can sing one more song, and we'll just go from there. And Billy goes and he sings a song that I love a lot, Ain't No God in Mexico, and a few others. And that album becomes, Waylon Jennings loves it. It becomes a hit record for Waylon Jennings. So there's a lot of good legends around country music here too, even if the music's not your thing.
I remember I watched like that BMW advert, and I listened to some kind. I remember hearing about a legend about like the devil making a deal with a rock star or a country musician or something. Is that like some folk tale? I don't know, but it was pretty cool, I thought.
It's a very classic like blues folk tale of some guy goes out and they make a deal with the devil, and they become the greatest guitar player ever. The more poppy version of that is there's a song called The Devil Went Down to Georgia, which I think sort of captured that a little bit later, but that's Georgia. No, I mean, there's a lot of really good storytelling. Like that's the thing. That's the reason that I like country a lot is like it's a very accessible style of music for a lot of different kinds of people to play. And Texas country music I think is really fun because you do have all of these different cultures sort of merging, from like the Southern Black culture to like the Southern white culture to like the Tejano and the Mexican community, as well as like those German Czechs. They came and they brought like the accordion and all those kind of things to it. And San Antonio has a lot of really great merging of culture. There's this guy Doug Somm, who is like a very legendary San Antonio artist, and he's a white guy, but the rest of his band were Tejano, Hispanic, Mexican Americans, and they sort of like captured how like the Beatles were sort of revolutionary by using a lot of different sounds and styles of music. It was very similar in a lot of ways to what was just sort of happening organically in San Antonio. And when Doug Somm and his band got really popular, they tried to market them as like another British invasion band. But because most of the band were, of a darker complexion, like Hispanic, all the photographs of them are always sort of obscured or from behind.
In the shadows,
could make people think they were from Liverpool, right?
Yeah. That's not cool. But yeah, fair enough. It was marketing, I suppose.
And I mean, I think that was more when they try to make it national. What?
Did it work at least? This whole
so I mean
strategy
that band's super legendary. Doug Somm and like the Texas Tornadoes is like beloved, like they're they're folk songs for Texans. That was less for the Texan audience as much as like when they tried to sell it to California and New York and other parts of the country to try to make them like a national pop sensation.
Yeah, for the mainstream, I suppose, sort of markets, they needed to become a bit whiter.
Yes, basically.
Tiny bit. Is there any way we could add a white person? Or fair enough. That's awesome. I'll definitely look into those. So now, moving on to more perhaps serious and sad things. Talking of politics, what are your views on the upcoming U.S. I mean, I don't know if there are any local elections, if you like to talk about them, for sure. But the upcoming presidential elections, do you think it's better to support third party now that Cornel West is running for the Greens, or sort of perhaps RFK? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
What's your
it's tough. Basically, this is maybe a little bit of a convoluted answer, but like this is like the project of left reckoning, is that right now there's a lot of people who might identify as progressive or as socialist in this country, but we don't have like a socialist party or a movement or anything like that. So there's all these debates when the presidential election comes around, like who should you support or not. And for me, I am like a socialist, so I believe not just in like those ideas, but like in the power of like a working class movement. And there's all these debates. Oh, do you vote third party, right? Maybe you can pressure the Democrats to change or maybe win, right? But when you're just sort of talking about a bunch of unorganized individuals, right, you don't really have the ability to deliver that, right? Because everyone's just going to make their own personal decision. And like I find a lot of times when talking about the presidential election, it's exciting, right? It's fun to watch, it's interesting to cover. But we get
definitely?
distracted in the US, because I think of the Bernie Sanders movement, the US left is like hyper fixated on like a one quick trick, to build working class politics, or, to build a left in this country, and, revolving around a presidential election. And I just think that Bernie was probably the best shot at that happening. And it didn't work. I don't think that was a waste of time. I think it was really beneficial in a lot of ways. But I think that like we've gotten as far with that strategy as we might be able to get. For me personally, Cornel West is like a very easy vote, right? He's like he shares my kind of politics. I think Joe Biden has sort of shown himself to be, a very poor leader of the country. And one thing that I think is really difficult, even like here in Texas, is like people don't realize, I think sometimes, how demoralizing these presidential politics can be for people. So here we have like a pretty serious crisis of non-voting, right? A lot of people don't vote here, and people very rarely ask them why, right? The assumption is always that they're sort of stupid and ignorant. But a lot of them will say things like, I supported Obama in 2008 and 2012, and my life got worse. I was promised a lot of things and they didn't materialize. Which, that's one thing that's like the Democratic Party's problem. But for those of us who are working on progressive and left campaigns in this state, we have that hurdle to get over with people, where it's like you come and you talk about a program like universal health care, or higher minimum wage, and people have sort of heard that, been there, done that. So there's a lot of difficulty with it. I think RFK is a charlatan. I think that he doesn't represent left politics. Somebody who's come out very clearly against Medicare for all, right? And I just, at a certain point, if you're going to support people who might not be able to win, what's the point in doing it for somebody who doesn't support your policies? Cornel West certainly represents those kind of politics. But for me, structurally, I don't see the organization that he is building right now to be able to get in a lot of buy-in with a lot of people who aren't particularly politically mobilized right now. Right. So it's like, it's one of those things. It's like, I support Cornel West, like personally, but like, I don't think that this is going to be the answer to like some of the demobilization that we have on the left. And there's a lot of, I think, really important fights that we really need to be focusing on. One that I think is really critical here in Texas and all across the globe is like the climate crisis and how we're going to reckon with that. Not only like are we going to pursue policies that maybe help out the climate, but what are those policies going to mean for working people? Because we've seen, green politics can be sort of used to push austerity on everyday people, or say that like you need to be the ones to sort of foot the bill versus like the big oil and gas companies or the state. So one thing here that I think is really important is working with union members and workers who work in the oil and gas industry, for example, right? Because those people are going to be really important for a transition, not only in the sense of like, oh, maybe they'll oppose a green transition, but also like these are people with very particular specialized technical knowledge of how to run an energy system, right? I don't know how to run an energy system. I don't know if you do, right? So we need to
Sure,
have.
yes, I do. Yes. For sure, for sure. Yeah. No, I think you're right. But just before talking about the climate crisis, though,
Mhm.
do you think RFK is more of a charlatan or just a crank? Because I think he genuinely believes this stuff. And on Cornel West, can you like? I have a basic suspicion of all kinds of religious authority figures. Can you trust a priest? Do you think it's? I don't know. It's just yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no, I agree with you on RFK. I think that RFK genuinely believes the stuff that he believes. The problem is the stuff that he believes is just
It's just
wrong
yeah,
and
funny.
silly. I don't think he's doing these things cynically, right? I think that he genuinely believes some of
Yeah,
his
yeah.
more fun stuff. But I think that like he's able to speak to, he's had some success. I mean, Biden looks like he's got this, like he'll very likely win the Democratic primary, but it's undeniable that RFK has been able to get enough support. And there's a question of like, is that nostalgia for the Kennedy family, right? It's a very well-known name in American politics, and there's like a whole mythology and dream of the Kennedy family saving the country.
Considering that I live in Iran and some people are nostalgic for him here, I think yeah,
Yes.
that's it. I think that's what's happening. But sorry,
um
yeah, sorry to cut you.
No, you didn't come up at all. So but I also think that like I don't agree with what he's sort of been pushing and saying, but I do think that like there's a lot of distrust of a lot of systems, big systems in America, right? A lot of RFK stuff is criticizing big pharma and those kind of things. I think the problem is that instead of criticizing the industry as it exists, there is this kind of like anti-science, anti-medicine aspect to it, which I find to be very reactionary. But there's
Yeah, I agree. There's
there's I think no doubt that like there's just a lot of frustration with things as they are, and people are maybe looking for alternatives. And I think that his ability to sort of galvanize the thing shows a weakness of the left that I think we need to be able to recognize, that like if somebody's able to pull people with stuff like that and we're not able to pull people, I mean that's bad for our movement. But yeah, on Cornel West, I mean, I think that in the U.S. There's been a very long tradition, particularly like in the early 20th century, of like Christian socialism, and I think that it speaks to a lot of to a lot of people. I can understand like your hesitation about maybe a religious figure in politics, but I don't think that Cornel West has any interest in sort of doing like biblical
no.
based like laws or policies, right? This is somebody who
He
can
always starts with nice stuff, but then I don't know. It's yeah, I think you're right, by the way, 100%. But it's just puts because his language is very religious as well, the way he talks. I think
but he
that
doesn't
puts me
just
off.
rely on religion either, right? He relies on
Yeah, sure.
philosophy and on music. And like I think more than anything with him, I mean, like I think that he's a very committed Christian, and I think that's important to him. But I think that like more than anything politically, what that does is it speaks to things in a language that folks can understand, right? It's something like it's a common language, a common understanding that I think could be really helpful, because I think we might talk about this a little bit later. Like we do have a tradition in this country of like homegrown socialist politics, but a lot of times for Americans, when they hear socialism, it's like this is a foreign force, right? This is something coming to this country to
From
change
Russia,
it. Yeah, from Russia,
probably.
or Germany, right?
Oh yeah.
But being able to speak to these things in like a kind of common American cultural understanding, I think is like it can be really, really beneficial. And like if you look at American society, while like religiosity is like certainly on decline, particularly with like our generation, most of American society has been really atomized. And what I mean by that is like social organizations for the most part are in decline. Most people's like sociability is like almost exclusively something that you do when you go out, right? You go to a bar, you go to a restaurant. Like being a member of a social club or social organization, let alone a political one, that's on the decline. While churches, even though they're losing members, like there still is community there. And I've seen it, I have my own, I'm not like a religious person, so like I share that it's not for me, but in a lot of political movements that I've been a part of here and across the country, there's a lot of fire and brimstone churches in Texas and the South, right? Really reactionary right-wing ones, but there's also a lot of really progressive ones that will show up, and they'll mobilize their membership for things against like racist policies or over policing of poor people and things like that. And I don't think we should shy away from it, right? And there's like very strong traditions, for example, in the Americas of liberation theology, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but predominantly a lot of socialist movements there came out of people who were associated with the church, and they were able to sort of merge socialist and social politics with those already existing social organizations. So I'm not too worried about Cornel West Christianity right now. I think we're a long way away from if anything, if people who were religious in this country weren't solely being pulled to the right, I think that would definitely be a good thing for American politics right now.
No, I think you're 100% right. I'm just being a bit of a curmudgeon and a bit of a, I have a reputation to keep. I can't really, just support a religious person. So, but yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. So now, I don't know. Do you think? What do you think of Republicans? By the way, Trump. Do you think Chris Christie has a chance of stopping the big bad wolf, or he's gonna huff and puff?
I think Trump has the Republican Party on lock. He's in control of it. I don't know if you've been following or seen, but he's indicted right now, and he's had all these legal scandals, and people are like, "Oh, this is going to sink Trump." In fact, it's made him stronger. They've made him more popular in public polling. I think
a victim now. I think
he's a victim.
Narrative.
They're coming for him for challenging the deep state or whatever. And the thing that's really amazing about Trump is that like when he was in office, right, he really just delivered a lot of traditional Republican policies. He just did it with a little bit more cruelty and like spectacle, which I think is a bad thing for society. But what he represented was like an avatar of the Republican movement, and I don't think anyone has been able to capture it. Ron DeSantis, who's his closest challenger, literally has been trying to do it. Like there are great videos you can see, like he's changed the way that he stands to sort of start standing.
Oh, really? I haven't noticed that one. Really?
Yes. So he started to change his
doing this as well
to do this thing that Trump does. Yes. So he started to talk more like Trump, but it's just like, you can't, like, Trump is awful, but I have to admit, I think Trump is very funny. It's very funny to listen to him talk. It's entertaining. And no one can
show on earth, I think, right now.
It's very good. I mean, we have a lot of fun on Left Reckoning watching Trump videos. But I'll tell you one thing about Trump that I think is really fascinating, and I was dead wrong on when he first announced, is like the Republican Party, its hotbed of power is in the South and in Texas. And if there's any kind of person that is like the enemy for that kind of politics, it is like a New Yorker, right? Like very much like they don't like New Yorkers.
What's the term? Carpetbagger? What's the?
So yeah, carpetbagger is like somebody who comes to the South from the North, and like it comes from after the Civil War, where basically they would sell people false goods and take advantage of like the poverty in the South. But with Trump, I mean, look, yeah, he lives in Florida now, right? Right, he moved to the South, but he runs the Republican Party in Texas. In a way that is really pathetic, I find, for Texas politicians, that they have to grovel and sort of follow Trump's mannerisms and style of doing politics. It's interesting. Like our governor right now, Greg Abbott, who's very likely to be
Oh,
Texas's longest serving governor, has been such a political chameleon, right? When Bush, our former George W. Bush, was the governor and the president, Abbott, presented himself as a good Bush Republican. And then, in the tens, in the 2010s, he became more of a, kind of like Mitt Romney, Rick Perry style, small government, etc. And now he has completely embraced the kind of Trumpian style politics. I think you can really see that in border policy, because Bush, and I don't want to put forward the wrong impression of Bush, but there was this moment where it looked like there might be a window for some real immigration reform, and to stop sort of pushing for these very militaristic border policies. That's out the window now with Trump. It's like fundamental to that kind of politics. And you see that with Abbott. I mean, he's, going to the border saying, look at this big, beautiful wall that we're building. He's mobilized the Texas National Guard, which is like the state militia, to patrol the border. And he's tricking people and putting them on buses saying, hey, this is like a government program to deliver you to a place that's going to have jobs and healthcare for you. And then they just drop you off in a parking lot in Massachusetts or New York with, no resources. Right. And the cruelty is like the point of it. Right. It's spectacle. And, they've really inherited.
No, 100, just the point is to make, like, to show if you come, what could happen to you, I suppose.
Yes. And they've really embraced Trump. Trump is one of the most powerful figures in like local Texas state politics. Like a Trump endorsement is like the crown achievement. And they've basically have all bowed down to him in a way that I don't know. I don't know if they like it. I reckon probably privately they don't like it very much, but they've just accepted it at this point.
Yeah, I think right. I mean, Texas is a bit surprising because you would have thought the oil connections of Bush family and all that, they would have everybody in their pocket or something. I would have thought, so that's interesting. I didn't know, but yeah, that's fascinating. Just before you go, I've heard you mention that you're writing a historical article for Jacobin coming out very soon. So I thought maybe you can tell us about that, and then I have a couple of stupid questions which will be very quick to end on.
Hell yeah. Yeah, I'm working on this piece. It's taken me a little bit too long. I'm sorry to my editor, but I've been doing a lot of history stuff recently. So I did a long piece a little while ago. People could check out in Jacobin. It's called When Texas Cowboys Fought Private Property, and that's a story of the fence cutting wars, where a bunch of cowboys basically fought against the enclosure and the privatization of land in the state. But this big piece that I'm working on is a kind of history of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which was a very radical and integrated union in the South before the Civil Rights Movement. And what it was is like, so after slavery ends, the same people owned the land and the farms, and they needed people to work on them. So they created the system of tenant farming. And what that meant is that you lived there, you were no longer owned, you were no longer a slave, but it created a kind of debt slavery for people, because you had to pay for the tools, you had to pay for the seed, you had to pay for all of these things that basically people can't leave, because they're indebted to the landlord or to the company store in town. And the vast majority of the South workers were like working under these conditions. And the Southern Tenant Farmers Union started up around the same time as when the Socialist Party was reaching its zenith in the US. And they realized, a couple things is, one, they had tremendous amounts of power. So if they refused to pick cotton or cash crops, then the landlord, couldn't get their money. So they had a lot of leverage in fighting back against them. But they also broke from a very real problem historically in Southern organizing, was, creating racial animus, right? So, the rich in the South have always been able to sort of pit poor white workers and poor working class Black people against each other, right? And it would work really well, right? Because if one group gets organized, and you bring in the other group to scab against them, right? So the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, one of their fundamental principles was like cross-racial organizing, and it was radically successful in improving the lives and conditions for workers. It's a really fascinating history because they not only had to come up against the landlords, but also under FDR, during the war, they had something called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, where they were actually paying farmers and large landholders to not farm and work the land, to try to stabilize prices. And the way that system worked is the government would pay you for not growing. But the problem was, for the people who worked on those farms, the landlord was just getting money from the government, and those people weren't getting any money.
So the money wasn't being passed down.
Yes,
basically.
It wasn't being passed on. Even though,
are you saying trick economics is not true? Is that what you're
look at American history, you'll see that has never been the case, friend. But it's a really fascinating history, and I think it's important for a few reasons. One, because I think there's a lot of organizing and political lessons to learn. And two, like one of the big projects of Left Reckoning, I think too, is to remind folks that, like, if you're like from here, right, like your grandparents and your great grandparents, like they were radicals and they were socialists and they were like people fighting for something different. And there's a lot of kind of propaganda to sort of say like, oh, the South has always been, conservative, right? And it's just not the case. There's been a lot of work to make people believe that. But if you start reading into history, particularly like people's history, right? Like the actual history of like working people, you learn that like, you are far more likely to be related to a fence cutter, like I was talking about a second ago, or Southern Tenant Farmers Union member or Socialist Party member, than to some of these more reactionary and right-wing movements. And it's a really interesting story. And like, I don't know. I've been obsessed with this, so I have like all these things.
Tell us if there's an interesting anecdote that comes to mind or something.
Yeah, one quick thing is, I think, remembering that education is something that we should always want to promote and push for working class movements. The guy whose biography I'm reading is this guy, H.L. Mitchell, and he became a radical socialist because, he wasn't educated, but he started getting books in the mail, and he read Shakespeare and Marx and Lenin and all these things. And there's this weird debate that's happening in the US of like, oh, we shouldn't do theory as part of like our movements, right? Because people won't be able to understand that. And I think that's wrong-headed, right? Because it's also very insulting to people. But it's also just historically inaccurate, because the most radical movements have always had those things be a major part of it. But yeah, anecdotes. I think one of the most beautiful parts of the story was how people sort of got around like the racist laws at the time, right? So there would be things where white members would infiltrate organizations like the KKK, if people aren't familiar, like very racist institution, and they would infiltrate
global brand.
Yeah, I'm
global
sure
brand.
They would infiltrate it, not to, support it, but actually to, one, be able to warn people about what they were planning. And literally, like, there are some examples of them stealing ballot boxes when the KKK was sort of running elections in small southern towns. They would get somebody inside of it to sort of steal the ballots and change the results of the election to keep the KKK members from winning elected office in Arkansas. But one of the things I think is really beautiful is in when the tenant farming got really rough, and the tenant farming ended because industrial agriculture replaced it, the southern tenant farmers got together and they started building up, getting money from socialists across the country to buy land and build these interracial communities. So you had Black people and white people living right next to each other. And we're talking in the 40s. And growing food, sort of living communally, in really, really racist parts of the country, with a lot of rules about like you couldn't intermingle or socialize with each other, and building those things. And H.L. Mitchell says this, and I think it's very true, that a lot of in the civil rights movement, having an example of an integrated South for leaders of the civil rights movement was very inspirational for people to say, like, we don't have to live in a segregated country, right? We can live side by side without this kind of, racial hatred and animus politics that's dominated so much of Southern history. So it's a really beautiful part of that. I mean, it's a brutal part of it, obviously, too, but like the people standing up and trying to fight for something different, I think is really inspiring. And I think it's important to remember the contributions of like labor and radical organizing in sort of building some of the groundwork for the general changes that happened during the civil rights era later.
No, that's good. Yeah, that is truly good, because I mean, segregation is not just even an idea that is exclusive to the white supremacists. Plenty of other supremacists that were fan of segregation. So that's great. I have to say something about the theory thing. I find there is too much reverence, though, for people of the past, and including Marx or whatever, Adams, whoever. There is just way too much reverence. But I completely agree. Theory is important, and I think average person these days is probably much more knowledgeable of average theoretician of like people like, especially Kant. I really don't like him. Or John Locke.
Fair.
It's just, and they did. I mean, a lot of it is because they didn't have the knowledge we do have today, the empirical knowledge or whatever. So.
Well, I mean, I think on that, like in terms of strategy, it's like, well, then I think it's really important for people to have access to understanding those things, to either accept them or reject them. Because one thing that I think is really dangerous in a socialist movement or workers movement or anything is when certain people have the special knowledge and other people don't.
Oh,
right.
Sure. Yeah.
So like if you have an organization where like, oh, the people at the top have read all the theories, so that like if you say, hey, I don't think that this strategy we're doing makes sense, or I don't know what, well, that person can be like, well, I've read the books that you haven't, and I have that special knowledge. I think in terms of building more democratic movements, opening up that access to knowledge is absolutely critical, right? And I get like, I get why people sometimes will say like, oh, well, we don't want to turn all of our movements, for example, into like just reading and debate clubs. But also like those can be really important. But beyond that, like it's like this kind of idea of democratizing access to knowledge, right? Because I don't think that like a lot of people don't have the ability in this country, because like public education has been so underfunded, to even like, I'm not even talking about politics at this point. I'm talking about just like literature and philosophy and like art and things like that. Like it's a very, this is like our human inheritance, and like delivering that to working people, I think, should certainly be a part of any left movement. And as somebody who grew up very poor, white trash as they call us, I do have a little disdain for people who say that everyday folks can't wrestle or entertain or work. And I'm not saying you're saying that, but like I think it's important to recognize that, like, these are people who didn't even have an education system like we have today, who are jumping into these things.
No, I mean, you're right. I'm coming from it from this point of view that I think, should we bother the working people with this nonsense? Like some of it could be forgotten to history as far as I'm concerned, really. But I mean, I definitely agree with you that it's an inheritance. And since it's being used to manipulate power and not, it's like the Catholic system for 600 years that, trust us, we know what it says in the book, sort of. It shouldn't be like that at all. But I'm just saying that I feel there's just too much reverence whenever your people are teaching about these people, instead of critical outlook, even from critical sort of people.
Well, I mean,
that was general.
I mean, I hear you. I think that particularly with like Marx and like Marxist thought, I think it is very important today. That's why we do, for example, as you mentioned, like these Marx readings on the show, because I'm very much of the opinion that most people recognize and understand that they're being screwed over, right? That the system's not working for them.
That's why they don't vote, because I think they correctly calculate that it's not worth my time. So I think, that's
no, totally. But like people recognize that, but then what are you going to do, right? And like, let's be ambitious for a second. let's say that we build up some kind of movement here that has some kind of elected power. Transitioning like the American economic and political system from the one we have today to maybe the one we would like is not just going to take people who have like a lot of heart and like care and passion. It's going to take an understanding of what these kind of systems do. Like, to give like a very concrete example, it's one that I really love. I don't know if you're familiar with Fred Hampton.
Oh, of
um
course. Great. I think it was a pretty good movie. I know some people on the left considering it, but I thought that was
It's
a pretty
fun. I
good
mean,
movie.
it's a very fun film. I
Yeah.
did a video for Jacobin a few years back called Political Theories for Everyone, which people might, Jacobin.com. I mean, not on YouTube, you can find it. And
Mhm.
in it, we play this clip of Fred Hampton. And he's talking about, so there's a proposal that the Black Panthers put forward to start to build a public bank, right? Because banking in this country was very racist, and people didn't have access to credit, and that creates a very distinct difference between whites and blacks, right? If you can't get a loan to buy a house, you're not gonna be able to buy a house. So he gets this proposal. It's the correct proposal, right? We want to have this. He becomes furious when he reads it because there was no political education part at the beginning to explain why we need it, right? And he wasn't just being fussy. He makes this argument that I think is correct. He's like, if people don't understand why we're doing what we're doing, when we are in power, people will be very likely to maybe like attack these things, weaken them, or in fact just be corrupt. And he talks about a lot of successful revolutions in Africa and in the Caribbean, where these radical movements come into power, and then people see like, oh, there's money here, I'm just going to take it because it's like available to me, instead of understanding like this is something that there's like an example of our collective power. It's really important to utilize something like this. If these things just become neutral, there's money sitting in this bank, right? And it's not, this is a representation of our power and our ability to organize and mobilize, then yeah, it becomes very simple and easy to sort of justify, maybe cynically, skipping some money off of the top, right? So like doing that kind of like political education work, I think is important, both like in the now, but I think even more importantly in the long term, of like actually laying, because like we grow up in a kind of very individualist system, and like and we grow up under like American capitalism, so you think about the world in a certain way. To be able to build a different kind of society, we actually have to like unlearn a lot of things and like sustain this different kind of knowledge. And I think that that's, and it was like, you look at revolutions all across the globe and you can see how they can be very successful in some aspects, and then they can decline and sort of resort to previous styles of governance or economic policy. And that happens when you don't have that kind of political education, I think.
No, I mean, I think it definitely contributes to 100% agree. Just sometimes I feel some people are religious about Marx and stuff. It's very reminds me of certain other people. But uh, just to finish off though, just for something fun, you mentioned in an interview, I saw that you know Gugush, and I
Yes, I do.
recently learned that you have some connections to Iranians. So how do you know Gugush, and what do you think of Iranian music, I suppose, I guess, if you're familiar with Iranian 60s, 70s pop?
I mean, I love Gagoosh. I mean, going to a Persian or an Iranian wedding is always a very good time.
Yes.
I've been very blessed to know. I've known for like a redneck kid. I've been very blessed
Oh,
to know a lot of Iranians, not just in my immediate family now, but just friends and family. I don't know what it is. It's something that's always opened itself up to me. But yeah, no, I mean, I'm a big fan of Gagoosh. It's always a good time.
any
Uh,
anybody
so
else, or anybody else,
not that I'd be able to come up with off the top of my head. I
Fair
have
enough.
to admit, but it's the music that's on in the background when I see family. So I always enjoy it.
Yeah, I know. That's good. It's good. I'm glad you yeah, I'm glad Gugush has such a big reach. I mean, she's very famous. Are you familiar with the drama surrounding her?
No, what's the
Her
drama?
life in general? Oh,
Mm-mm.
she's just, I mean, she's a fountain of drama. She's been like married, I think, 12 times, and uh including to like a gangster and a communist, or sort of like a socialist at some point, or like artist type. It's just she's great. She's great. I mean, you should definitely ask about her. Fountain of interesting stories.
Oh, I certainly will. Yeah, I know. I've been lucky on that. I've also been very lucky to have been able to eat a lot of really great Iranian food.
Oh, nice. Oh, I was going to ask you about tech. What's I've heard you have great grills in Texas. Is that
Yes,
true,
yes.
or
No, Texas
is
barb.
that
I think Texas barbecue is the best out there. It's a lot of beef, which is the most of the South is pork. So we do brisket. You cook it for 20 hours. You
20
know,
hours?
yeah, it's a
How,
very long
on a
time. I mean,
grill?
usually I use like it. I mean, I do it too. So like, there's a lot of different
Yeah.
styles, right? So you use a offset smoker, which is basically it's made out of a big oil drum, and on the side of it there's a firebox where you put the wood in and you cook it really low. I'm sorry, I'm so bad with Celsius conversions, but like you
No, no,
cook it at
fair
like
enough.
225 Fahrenheit for really really long time. And what happens is, like, the brisket's really tough meat, but when you cook it that long, the fat completely
Melts.
becomes liquid, and then it becomes some of the most tender and juicy food. But we also have really good Mexican and South Texas
Mm.
barbecue as well, like barbacoa, which traditionally what you do is you dig a huge pit into the
Oh,
earth.
I've seen that on YouTube. I think that's
Yeah,
they
and you
put a
just put,
chicken or so.
or you do goat and beef in
Wow.
particular, and sometimes they'll do like the whole, they do the for barbacoa traditionally use the whole cow head, so the cheeks have really
Nice.
good meat on it, and you cook
Uh,
that overnight, and you just bury it and you come back in the morning, and that's out of this world. But I've also been just a little fusion. I've been working on my kebab, which I'm
oh,
very
nice.
excited about. Very hard to
I mean,
do.
the thing you just mentioned reminds me of, do you know kelle pache, the morning breakfast of the champions in Iran?
I've heard of it. I've never had it though.
It's disgusting. It's the most, I can't even like, I mean, I can't even walk past the shop. It's the smell. It's a head of a cow. It's a head and hooves of a cow, and they're like kelle, head, and pache, which is hooves. And it's, yeah, exactly. It's the cheek. And who I don't know. It feels like those parts shouldn't be eaten. I'm no vegetarian, but or the eye and the brain, and it's just like, oh my
I'll
god,
skip
the
the eye.
smell.
I'll skip the eye. I can do brain, but eyes are too nasty for me generally.
It's all of it. The smell. This I can't believe it. Wait, does it smell the one that they cook on the ground? What was it, Barbie?
Barbacoa. I mean,
Barbacoa.
it smells more of smoke. Like
I see.
we use, and a
That's
big
good.
thing here too is like the kind of wood you use really matters. So we use pecan wood, which is very sweet, mesquite, which is, some people don't like it because it's like a little astringent, but it's very traditional, and
Ah,
post oak, which is what we use here. But there's a very great YouTube channel if you want to check it out, of this guy in Dallas, who's Iranian. It's called Cafe Bagari, and he's like a legend for me because he's a master of both like Texas barbecue cooking and
and
like
Iranian.
Iranian food. So when he does a brisket, you have to trim it, and there's a lot of meat that you cut off just to get it like in the perfect shape. So when he makes brisket, the day before he'll use the trimmings and he'll make kebab, right? So he'll make
Oof.
like Iranian kebab, on Thursday, and then on Friday it's Texas barbecue, which I feel like is a very beautiful and very
It's
lucky and luxurious style of cooking to be able to enjoy.
no. It feels like a very, very beautiful lifestyle, and I
Yes,
like
I'm very jealous of
to
it.
join. I like to have that. Yes, that sounds amazing. Yeah, and that's your like job. Like
Yeah,
that is
exactly.
just fantastic. That is, yeah, truly. But have you tried? What do you think of not Iranian kebab, the sort of homemade foods? Have you tried those? Did you like
Oh
them?
yeah, I mean, like gourmet sabzi, I think is my favorite.
That's yeah. It's
I mean, I'm very lucky. I mean, obviously, as whenever I go and visit my fiance's family, I mean, that's what we're eating, and I I feel very
oh
lucky,
nice, very
so I
nice.
get very good traditional home cooked meals. And yeah, I mean,
No,
Best in June is another favorite of mine as well.
oh very. Do you have it sweet or sour?
Usually a little bit more on the sour side, at least is how
But
her
by the way,
family
just
likes it.
just for people who don't know, fesencin is a dish that with even though it's highly popular, it's a very grand dish as well. It's like for royalty and stuff. It does look like poo on rice, basically. That's how it looks like. It's for royalty and yeah, it's really. Sorry, but I cut you off.
Oh no, I'm saying I agree. I mean, I love Iranian food in general. It's I think it hasn't been Instagramized, and what I mean by that is like a lot of food is like made for the
like
pictures.
Turkish food.
Right?
Okay, fair enough. Yeah,
I don't think it looks bad, but like there's certain food like cheesy.
No, fesencin looks
like...
bad. No, fesencin looks bad. I think korma sabzi maybe not, but fesencin definitely. But no, you're right. It's about taste. It's not about the looks so much.
And I think you might think is funny, but so we have like a lot of Iranians in the area, so there's some good restaurants. But I do think a lot of like Americans, predominantly like white Americans, don't know what Iranian food is going to be like, and they think it's going to be like Indian food. So you can go, and they think it's going to be really spicy. And it's very funny to me when you go, like whenever I see a new Persian restaurant that I want to check out.
No.
You read the review, and like all the Scots, like the guys Scots and the Tims, they'll say like 2 stars, like it wasn't spicy at all. But then you'll see like the Arash's, commenting like this is the best food, and it's a good place.
Yeah. That's great. So that's no, Iranian food famously we avoid a spice, especially people like northerners like me. We just that was the thing you were talking about Mexican food in Texas. Is it very spicy or has it?
Oh yeah, we like our food's very spicy. Not all of it, but a lot of it's very spicy. So no, I think that's definitely.
Is Tabasco from Texas?
No, Tabasco's from Louisiana. So most of the hot sauces here are like Mexican, like Valentina's and a few others. But salsa, which is just like peppers and onions and tomatoes as a sauce, is like the big thing here. The other really big Texas food, if we're just talking about that stuff, is chili, which a lot of people make wrong. Because chili is like an old cowboy dish, and like the real traditional way to do it is it's just beef and chilies, nothing else, no tomatoes, no beans or anything like that.
Raw beef?
No, you cook
like
it for a really
tartar?
long time. No, you cook it for a really long time. But you just take dried chilies, you hydrate them, and you cook it for 6-7 hours. And I think, I don't know, that might be our like gourmet sabzi in the sense of like there's like the picture for like the barbecue, like that is just like a very important dish for Texans.
It's associated with national pride, and people get killed over it. Is that
people get very, very passionate about it? And because it got so popular, they make chili in the rest of the country, but they make it with beans, and they don't put peppers in it. They just put powdered pepper, chili powder on it. And chili outside of Texas is just awful. And I'll die on that hill.
Yeah. I mean, I've only had chili like UK and Iran, so I don't think I've had a good one. But I need to visit Texas, and I think you need to visit Iran. The local ingredients do add a tiny bit to the taste, but I'm sure.
I'd love to. One day I really, really would love to.
Yeah, I mean, you're American, so you have to be a bit careful. But yeah, you should come. I mean, you're anti-imperialist, so it's fine. You should come. It's safe. It's safe for you. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But thank you so much for giving us your time. And I think I went a bit over more than 1 hour. But thank you again. It was a pleasure. I don't know if you have anything else to promote or anything else you want to point out.
No, I mean, check out Left Reckoning if you haven't seen it before, and read Jacobin, not just for my stuff, but they're doing a lot of really good work. So, and thank you so much. It really has been a pleasure.
No, thank you so much. So, thanks everyone. Hope you enjoyed the talk. At least I did. So, it doesn't matter too much.